Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Alex Hoyer.
He took to the road, he took to the steamships. And
this was a very high-profile tussle at the time.
This isn't often talked about. Essentially, there was already motion happening. This wasn't so radical of a thing to have happened.
This Thursday marks the 159th anniversary of Missouri Emancipation Day. On January 11, 1865, delegates to a state convention led by radical Republicans passed the immediate emancipation of all enslaved people. This was about 2 years after President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and about 11 months before the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution that abolished slavery. Also happening this Thursday is an event at the Missouri History Museum to commemorate this anniversary. A little bit later, we'll talk with a board member of Father Dickson Cemetery, a historic black cemetery in South St. Louis County. But first, I'm joined by Cicely Hunter, public historian for the African American History Initiative at the Missouri Historical Society. Welcome.
Thank you. It's so good to be here.
I mentioned a few dates in the intro, but I want to go back 40 years before the start of the Civil War to the Missouri Compromise of 1820. How did that compromise set up Missouri and its complex history with slavery?
Yeah, so essentially, Missouri as well as Maine were admitted. And so Missouri stands in as the slave state, right? And then you have Maine who comes in as a free state. So they were brought in simultaneously. So it's interesting because right alongside the river, right alongside the Mississippi River, you have Illinois, which is seemingly considered to be a free state, but you have Missouri situated as this border state, and that complicates relations within Missouri. And so you have simultaneously free and enslaved people sometimes working alongside one another. You have people who are literally on these steamboats traversing the river and working alongside the levee near St. Louis. And so life is very, very complex, right? It's not just necessarily, we can't think about it as like a southern rural area, but this is very much a complex place. But it's also interesting because we have to think about William Will Brown's book, and he talks about how slavery here in St. Louis was just as harsh and detrimental as it was in the deepest of the South. So a very complex place to be in. And yeah, it's really eye-opening and jaw-dropping just to kind of think about what's going on in Missouri, in St. Louis specifically at that time.
And throughout the country, slavery was so complex because above a certain line, slavery should not have been permitted in any new state. And then the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 kind of did away with that. But before we talk about more, I feel like the issue of slavery is so often sanitized today, where it becomes this historical topic and we don't really understand what it was like and what it was for people who were enslaved. What was it like for Black people who were enslaved during this time?
Yeah, so I can speak a little bit to St. Louis. So life in St. Louis for an enslaved person, as I mentioned, they could work alongside free people. And a lot of times that was a really tense relationship. So you have a lot of people, white folks at that time, who really wanted to do away with free population. Essentially, they were like, hey, we need to get the free people out of here, because what's going to end up happening is they're going to taint the minds of those who are enslaved. Oftentimes, too, you would see, which is a little bit different in some cases, but you would see enslaved people working alongside slaveholders. That was common. So we don't necessarily here in St. Louis have the large slave plantations as you would have in the Deep South, right? But it might have been smaller scale enslavement, but nevertheless, it was still harsh, and it was still dangerous sometimes to navigate the streets. Sometimes, enslaved populations were free, but as long as they had, paperwork with them, they were able to navigate that. But that did not necessarily mean that they could not be captured and sent back south, right? Or sent back into slavery in some other location. So life in St. Louis was very different, as I said, than the Deep South.
Yeah. So Missouri was a border state during the Civil War, and it remained in the Union. But what was going on in Missouri at the outset of the war in 1861?
So essentially what happens is I feel like this isn't often talked about a whole lot, but it should be, because essentially what happens is you have Major General John C. Fremont, who is, he's actually representing the Western Department, and he's headquartered in St. Louis. So on August 30th of 1861, what transpires is he issues martial law. Right. And then then he puts forth a proclamation, and it's very controversial at the time. And so this proclamation essentially says that enslaved people are seemingly free. Right. And then it also talks about how people who were loyal to the Confederacy, their property can be stripped from them. Enslaved people, we can, at that time, they would have deemed enslaved people property. And they would then be taken to on the Union side, and they can support the Union in whatever form or fashion. So what transpires after that essentially is Abraham Lincoln catches wind of this.
From a newspaper article.
Yeah, catches news of this and is not happy. But he is not the only one that's not happy about this. You have people across the country who are like, what is going on in Missouri? This is crazy. Fremont is out of line. Kentucky, in particular, is another state that essentially they were very upset as well. And Lincoln got word that, people were really not happy about this. And a couple of letters are exchanged between September 2nd and between, I believe it was November 2nd. That's when Lincoln essentially says, we're going to actually have to remove Fremont from his role. And he actually, strips that commanding, the major general commanding office that he once possessed, he strips that from him. So it happens in some ways, we might not think of that as happening pretty quickly, but it essentially happens relatively quickly for that time frame. And
again, Fremont's emancipation was, January, it was early in the war. It was August 1861, and Abraham Lincoln was known for his timing, and so he did things on his terms. His thought at the beginning of the war that it was too soon, and that it would upset people who were kind of neutral in Missouri at the time. And he didn't feel like it was a martial law kind of action, that it had to be the federal government. And this idea of timing, why wasn't it right? Why wasn't it the right time for Lincoln?
Yeah, so it wasn't the right time, from my understanding, simply because they really didn't want to muddy the waters. Tension was already high at the time, and you don't want the border states in particular rattled by what's going on with this one particular state, because essentially it can send rippling effects across the border states and across the country. So essentially that was the problem, is like, no, this is not the time for this. But it is interesting that he then, by 1861, January 1st, that's when the Emancipation Proclamation is put into force, and it's issued. And so although at the time it was not, according to him, the right time for it, but essentially he had to roll that back by 1863, and it became the time for it.
Right. And John C. Fremont at the time, I mean, he was one of the most popular Americans. He had been a war hero and kind of a hero of westward expansion in the United States. And so this was a very high profile tussle at the time. Before Fremont's emancipation was rescinded, had it had any material effect of freeing people in Missouri between the time that it was enacted to the time that it was rescinded?
Oh, that's a good question. That is an excellent question. So I know that there were of course, there was the Confiscation Act that transpired, right? And that would have been like August August 6th of 1861. So Congress actually passed that, and essentially all that meant was that, enslaved people, or not necessarily enslaved people, but the territory would be turned over. But Fremont went that step further. But from my understanding, there was a pretty big uptick in Missouri of enslaved people coming from the South into the North. There were many who were actually, I think it was roughly around that time, maybe it even could have been around 1863, but folks who were trying to go to Kansas because there were benefits associated with enslaved people going to Kansas and participating in the war. So, for example, they could receive money, they could receive clothing, they can receive rations and housing, and even more, in some cases, more particular, the certificate of freedom for the soldiers and for their children and for their mothers. So there was certainly an uptick in populations of Black people. And so I can give you some numbers here.
Sure.
Yeah. So in Missouri, the population actually had decreased by 1863. So I'm just talking about all of Missouri to 73,811, but it was 114,931 enslaved people by 1860. And so earlier, those numbers were on the higher end in Missouri, and then they tilt in 1863. And like I said, it possibly could have been because of that Kansas movement that was really drawing people out west. So in St. Louis in particular, in 1860, there was roughly about 3,297 people living within the city limits. But by 1870, we see that number escalates, and it's at 22,088 people were in the city. So there is a bit of an uptick on that end as well. So those are just a few figures that we can think about. And when we even talk about Black people's involvement in the war effort, we can look to their contributions. It was said, I'm not necessarily focused on St. Louis at this moment or even Missouri, but it was estimated that there was 180,000 Black people who were present and active in the war.
And this is just in Missouri?
No, this is not necessarily. This is just, overall.
Okay.
Overall figures that were represented. I know, because that's a huge number, right?
Right.
Yeah. And then, you do have people in the city who are very much fortifying when the war does transpire, fortifying the city, that they're unloading supplies. They're, joining the fight, of course. You have many people. The 62nd Colored Infantry was one where there were many people who actually enlisted. And then you also have domestic work transpiring at the time, because that's also needed, right? And so you have all of these different layers to represent the populations that are pooling into St. Louis, into Missouri, and even going further out as well.
Well, we need to take a quick break, but we'll be back shortly to continue this conversation about the emancipation of enslaved people in Missouri. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
Support comes from Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to sustainable and sound conservation of the state's forests, which support more than 41,000 Missouri jobs, resulting in a $10 billion industry. ChooseWood.com.
Welcome back. I'm Alex Hoyer. I'm pleased to welcome another guest to the conversation, and that is Cathy Hart, a board member of Father Dickson Cemetery. That's a historic Black cemetery in South St. Louis County in Crestwood. Cathy will also be participating in the event at the Missouri History Museum. Cathy, welcome to you.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you.
Tell us about the namesake of the cemetery. Who was Father Moses Dickson?
Moses Dickson was born free in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1824. And so this year we're fortunate to be celebrating the 200th anniversary of his birth.
It's a big one.
Yeah, he was born free in Cincinnati, and as you know, Cincinnati is just on the other side of the Ohio River from Kentucky. And so Cincinnati got a lot of people escaping enslavement in the South, and they saw a lot of it, and there were a lot of racial tensions in Cincinnati at the time of Moses Dickson's childhood. And so he witnessed some very, very troubling things in Cincinnati. When he was about 16, with his barber training, he had been trained as a barber. He took to the road, or actually he took to the steamships and started traversing the South as an itinerant barber. And you know how it is with barbers and hairdressers, right? You hear a lot and you witness a lot. And so he became aware firsthand, not just what he had seen in Cincinnati, but he became aware firsthand of the atrocities and the inhumanity of slavery. And so he couldn't abide it. He just could not abide it. And he made the determination to do something about it.
What brought him to St. Louis?
What did bring him to St. Louis? Well, I know that he married a lady. His wife was from Galena, Galena, Illinois. And so I believe that St. Louis was, aside from Chicago, St. Louis was the booming place to be. And if you want to organize a group, if you want to be at the center of communications and what's happening, you want to be in a place like St. Louis at that time.
And so Moses Dickson helps found a secret organization called the Knights of Liberty.
Right.
Tell us about that group.
Right. Well, it was comprised of people that he met during his travels in the South, and it was a super secret organization. It had to be, because at that time, John Brown had unsuccessfully made a move at Harper's Ferry, and that had been violently put down. And so they knew it had to be a secret movement. So he had representatives from each one of the southern states that had enslaved persons, and they were recruiting, upon pain of death, they were recruiting people to hold to a commitment to work to free the slaves in an uprising if need be, without disclosing any of this. So as a testament to his charisma, his ability to convey the seriousness of the situation, it was reputed that they had anywhere from 47,000 to 150,000 people.
That's huge.
Committed to this endeavor. And what's fascinating is that almost nobody knows about it. But the reason nobody knows about it is because they were sworn to secrecy and they kept that secret. And so, I've often thought that a documentary could be made about this. It's so.
It sounds ripe for that. Certainly.
Exactly. But so few details were leaked. So that's part of what he did in establishing the Knights of Liberty here in St. Louis.
And this group also helped enslaved people through the Underground Railroad as well. Cicely Hunter, when we talk about the Knights of Liberty, how common was it for Black people to be associated with an organization like this, or were there even other organizations that they were involved with?
To my knowledge, the Knights were one of the biggest ones that existed in the country, from my knowledge base.
And then in terms of how they helped people through the Underground Railroad, maybe just explain what the Underground Railroad is for people who might not remember their lessons during grade school.
Yeah, so the Underground Railroad was essentially a network. And so a lot of times what would happen is enslaved people would be in contact with folks that would help them to get to freedom. We can even talk about Mary Meacham, right? She's a prime example. Yeah, exactly. So we know from record, from the newspaper accounts, where she was participating in the Underground Railroad. And some have even made the case that John Berry Meacham as well was doing the exact same thing. But we actually have record of her doing it and actually getting caught, right? So essentially they would go to a safe space and, chart out their destination, and they would meet up and they would go and pursue that freedom by any means necessary.
And this was a big deal here in St. Louis because, as you pointed out earlier in the hour, the proximity of Illinois, just across the river, being a free state.
Absolutely. Yeah. And even that, though, it's that even is a bit murky, too, because you do have slaveholders, right, in St. Louis and in other places along the border who are going to free territories as well. And they're still bringing their enslaved people, right? And so you do have that representation taking place. And, that was the case that Dred and Harriet Scott made, right? And countless others, right? Because we have these records of hundreds of people who were suing for their freedom on the basis that they were brought, for whatever reason, to a free territory or what have you, whether it be Wisconsin Territory in Illinois or wherever, right? So, yeah, it was certainly a method of emancipating oneself.
Mm-hmm. And Cathy, I understand that the Knights of Liberty gained popularity and stature during the Civil War, too. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it was primarily prior to the Civil War that they were organized. Mm-hmm. And I think about 3 or 4 years before the Civil War actually began, they were supposed to, in 1857, they were supposed to get started. They were going to gather in Atlanta, and it was going to be on at that point. But Moses Dickson was testing the winds of war that were present in the United States at that time. And he knew that things were going to get very serious between the Union and the secessionist states. And he thought it best to just kind of press pause. Let's not jump into this yet. Let's see what the federal government is going to do about this situation, about freeing the slaves. And so they stepped back just to see. And sure enough, the war began, and they, rather than assemble themselves as an army in themselves, they went to fight for the Union Army.
And really, if the alternative approach had happened, that would have, it seems, very much changed the course of history. We talked earlier about Abraham Lincoln being a master of timing. It sounds like Moses Dickson was also a master of timing, too.
It would seem that way, yes.
I have in my notes here that the group's oath was, quote, "I can die, but I cannot reveal the name of any member until the slaves are free."
That's correct.
Cicely, so January 11th, 1865 is when Missouri's emancipation was passed. We kind of had that false start in 1861. And this was 2 years after Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. And again, just a few months before the end of the Civil War. What were those final months in Missouri like, particularly for enslaved people?
Yeah, so they still were, as I mentioned, were very prevalent and prominent within the war framework and involved in any way, shape, or form. And as I mentioned too, we just have to think about the sheer number of people who are coming into St. Louis, Missouri, right, and who are either passing through or actually stopping in Missouri. And so they're very much active and a part. And so in some cases, some scholars have made the argument, well, what they did wasn't so much of a radicalized a move, right? Because in so many cases, like, you already had populations of people who are already here in contraband camps and who are considered to be free, right? Because with those contraband camps, essentially, that was ushering them into a life of freedom as much as possible. So it would provide shelter, it provide hospitals, it will reunite families, which is one of the major components of slavery, was essentially to break down the family, right? Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, so this move was, in some ways, it needed to organically happen on the basis that a lot of these things were already in motion. And the delegates, I think in 1864, the radical delegates are then, by the white popular vote, are actually voted in. And so I think people knew what was already on the horizon, is my assessment. Right? And
so Missouri wanted to get kind of ahead of, like they knew what was happening, and so they wanted to kind of preempt it in a way?
I mean, you can make that argument. But yeah, I think what was already going on in the space in and of itself was evident, and sometimes, you have policy makers enacting certain things kind of after the fact. I'm not necessarily, I might be making a speculation here, but just saying that essentially there was already motion happening. And so this wasn't so radical of a thing to have happened.
Right. But also necessary, because Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation a couple years before only applied to states that were in rebellion against the Union. And so it was certainly kind of a necessary step. And then, of course, we have the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution that abolishes slavery. And we cannot think, oh, there is emancipation. It certainly doesn't equal equality. And right. I think a lot of people may assume that it did. What was it like during Reconstruction for Black people here?
Yeah, so you have the Freedmen's Bureau, who is actively trying to do what they can to provide resources to populations who are free. But, scholars debated whether it was effective, whether it wasn't effective. Things get rolled back, things progress. But I think that's just the nature of how things unfold, right? So you do have like you have a step forward, and then you sometimes take that step back. And I think in some cases, scholars have made the case that Reconstruction was supposed to be so productive for Black populations, but it didn't necessarily have the motion behind it that I think people really hoped it would. So yeah, you definitely do have that.
Yeah. Cathy, I want to turn back to Father Dickson. What happened to him after the war?
Well, after the war, Moses Dickson returned to St. Louis, and he became the president of the Refugee Relief Board here. And as Cicely was saying, offering persons who were migrating either to St. Louis or to points beyond, maybe Kansas, maybe Chicago, to be able to offer them some source of comfort in their life. They escaped the South with nothing most of the time. And so they needed food, they needed shelter, they needed clothing. In our case, they needed a place to be buried. They had nothing. And so it was the role of the Refugee Relief Board to provide as much as possible and to gather supporters from the white community as well, to be able to offer this to these escaped persons.
And the cemetery that is named after him in Crestwood that opened in the early 1900s, and I think the last people were buried there in the 1970s, is that right?
Correct.
And we were talking before the mics went on about the cemetery achieving status in 2021 on the National Register of Historic Places. And we've covered on this show just the bad conditions at a lot of cemeteries where Black folks are buried. How
Correct.
Are things going at the cemetery there?
They're beautiful. The cemetery is beautiful. We have evolved from doing most of the physical work ourselves to engaging a wonderful group of volunteers, very dedicated volunteers who help us to maintain the property, and also a group of supporters who will help us to fund professional lawn care for the cemetery. So it's looking great, and people are making it work.
That is great to hear. And in concluding, I want to just talk about the event that's happening this Thursday from 5 to 8 at the Missouri History Museum. Cicely, what can we expect on Thursday evening?
Yeah, so we hope that folks will come out, and we'll have, of course, like our food and drink that can be for purchase through Key Bistro. We'll also have some resource tables provided by many of the people who will be talking that evening. We will have a pop-up conversation about the role of enslaved midwives during the antebellum period, and then we'll have our main stage event. And so essentially what happens is Greenwood, Father Dickson, St. Peter's Cemetery will share stories about Black individuals who are living in the community in 1865. So lots going on, but it's going to be a great time. So you definitely want to join us.
Thank you both for being here today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having us.
This episode was produced by Maya Norfleet.
Our audio engineer is Aaron Dorr. This podcast was mixed and edited by Aaron.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
St. Louis on the Air proudly supports local artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.